Good morning, or depending when you're watching this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and as always told, out of voice of radio, though it might sound a little bit weird, because I'm in a slightly different recording location just for today. But today, we've got a new Hoopa card we need to be talking about. So let's have a chat about Hoopa. Our translation here does, of course, come from the lovely David Hochmann over at RappelmannTCG over on Facebook. And if we start off having a little bit of a look at the basics here, it's got that 130 HP number that we are so excited about. Means you can take a hit from something like Zoroark and still survive. Unfortunately, not the non-GX Buzzwole because of the whole weakness to fighting thing. Fighting weakness is not a good weakness to have right now, because you're sharing a weakness with Pikarom and Zoroark, that are like the best Pokemon in the format. You don't want this weakness. It's not a good weakness. It is, in fact, a very bad weakness. Resistance to Psychic is quite nice. Malamar Dex, for instance, and a retreat cost of 2 is, let's say, incredibly uninspiring. Being a Darkness Pokemon, though, you do have Devoured Field to let you do an extra 10 damage if that's what you're into. But you're not really hitting much of anything for weakness. Maybe your Mimikyu and Gengar ends up becoming quite big and quite popular, and if that's the case, yay, weakness. Otherwise, boo, no weakness. But what does it actually do? Well, it's the first attack we are largely interested in here, and according to the lovely David Hochmann, you start off doing 10 damage, and then you do 20 more damage for each Pokemon your opponent has in play with an ability. Now, it never adds up to quite as much as you might like. This isn't some giant, huge, smashing powerhouse attack. You're not one-hit KOing Tag Team GXs with this. Unless, of course, you're up against your Mimikyu and Gengar. But this is for a single colourless energy on a basic Pokemon. So this can very, very easily be put into any deck you like. It literally could not be easier to tech this into a deck unless it had 0 attack cost, like your Alolan Vulpix. Otherwise, it just doesn't get any easier. So one colourless energy on a basic Pokemon, this is really nice. This is good. It's very, very techable. And it gets to decent damage. Now, obviously, the best case scenario here, your opponent has 6 Pokemon out that have abilities. You hit 130 damage. And that number is incredibly crucial. Because that 130 with a Choice Band becomes 160. That 160 with Devoured Field becomes 170. And oh, look, Tapu Lele gets KO'd. Now, I've got to be really clear about my examples here, because if I give you an example of a Pokemon that doesn't have an ability, that essentially takes 20 damage off the field. And that's the annoying thing about Hoopa. Every time your opponent drops a Pokemon that doesn't have an ability, that takes 20 damage off the field. But they're not always going to have a choice. So let's take something like Rayquaza Vikavolt. Now, admittedly, this has fallen a little bit out of favour, but it's still a fun deck. You've got Vikavolt, which has an ability, and you've got Rayquaza, which has an ability, and then they're probably going to use Tapu Lele, which has an ability. Maybe they end up playing something like a Makago for a little bit of extra consistency, which has an ability, or maybe an Oranguru for consistency, which incidentally does have an ability. And then all of a sudden, they're just peppering the field with Pokemon with abilities. This is not quite as good as something like the old Zoroark, which did more damage for each Pokemon your opponent had in play. This is each Pokemon your opponent has in play with an ability. Incidentally, we did see let's say a spiritual successor to this when Morial GX came out recently. I'll pop a link to that video in the description. But it's still quite nice. What might happen here is you actually force your opponent into an awkward situation where they want to bench an Oranguru, but then that will allow you to hit numbers they don't want you to hit. And that's kind of annoying. For them, it's great for you. You're never really going to get up to huge damage. Like I say, with your opponent having a full bench, all of their Pokemon having an ability, and you having a Choice Band and a Devoured Field, you do get to 170. You do get a one-hit KO on something like that Tapu Lele. But you're not going to do that very often. What you are going to do is force your opponent into a situation where they're thinking, I kind of want to bench this Pokemon, but is it worth giving them an extra 20 damage? And as soon as you get them to that point, you are in a great situation. I've made this point on a number of videos over the years. When your opponent is not doing something they want to do, in this case playing a Pokemon with an ability, to try and hurt your strategy, you're winning in that situation. You are having a very good time when that happens. And there are even a few decks where the Pokemon actually evolve from Pokemon with abilities. I'm generally thinking Eevee and Magikarp here. But if your opponent's using this and every time they don't evolve, they're essentially giving you an extra 20 damage. Now, we do need to talk a little bit about wordings here, because you got something like Alolan Muck. Now, we often talk about Alolan Muck turning off abilities, but we need to be extremely careful about the wording of Alolan Muck when it comes to this Pokemon. It reads, each basic Pokemon in play, in each player's hand and in each player's discard pile, has no ability. Now, compare this to something like Lysander's Lab, which turns off tools. You still have a tool, it just doesn't do anything, it has no effect. If an Alolan Muck comes down, all basic Pokemon have no abilities, they don't get to use them, but also they don't add 20 damage to Hoopa's attack here. But I want to go back to this whole teching it in thing, because you're not doing a huge amount of damage, you're not smashing here. But what you are doing quite beautifully is a decent amount of damage for a single colourless energy on a basic. So let's say you're against a deck that evolves from Eevee, maybe it's a Glaceon deck. It's a nice example because Glaceon also has an ability. And let's say they've played a Tapu Lele and they've got a couple of Eevee down. Well, now you're hitting 70 damage and you can get a one-hit KO on one of those Eevee. I don't think you're going to be getting giant smashy KOs with this, but I do see two situations in which this is a really nice attack. Firstly, it's fairly early on in the game. Your opponents drop stuff like Tapu Lele and a Rangaroo to try and get rolling. You can take out some evolving basics, and I do need to once again mention basic Pokemon colourless energy. The second use I see for this here is, it's the mid to late game. Your opponent's set up, but they've got a Makago down, and then they've got an Rangaroo, and they've got that Tapu Lele they played earlier. Maybe they've got a Dedenne they played earlier, and they're using a Pokemon that has an ability, maybe Zoroark here. And maybe they actually are now sitting there with 6 Pokemon in play with abilities, and you now can hit 170 and take out something like a Tapu Lele or a Dedenne. Incidentally, Dedenne, you just need the Choice Band, you don't need the Devoured Field. This could work. It is not a Pokemon around which to base a deck. It is not going to win you every game in a tournament. But it is a single card tech in literally any deck whatsoever that can take you a cheeky prize here or there. Tell me that doesn't sound like the kind of attack you want to occasionally be using. Now, as for the second attack here, I can't really condone this one brilliantly. 3 colourless energy, 80 damage, don't apply weakness and resistance. It was almost good. Because it's colourless energy, so it can be put into any deck whatsoever. You can use double colourless energy. You can use any kind of energy acceleration, like Malamar in Psychic decks, or the upcoming Welder in Fire decks. And then you've got a Pokemon that could, with a Choice Band, hit 220 against a Pokemon that is weak to darkness. Maybe Dawnwing's Necrozma all of a sudden gets super popular, even more than it was last time. Maybe Bayonet makes a bit of a comeback. Maybe we get a new Pokemon. But you don't hit for weakness. This had the possibility, the opportunity, of being an attack that you could use in any deck whatsoever with any energy acceleration or double colourless energy and get one-hit KOs on anything that's weak, and then it could serve the same function as the Onix from Lost Thunder. 4 colourless energy, 120 damage. It's not a great Pokemon. But in a format where we really want to be hitting for a fighting weakness, as we mentioned earlier, a basic Pokemon for colourless energy that can be put in any deck with decent energy acceleration, it's seen a fair amount of play. Hoopa could have been that for Darkness Pokemon. But it doesn't hit weakness and resistance. Now, to be fair, fairy Pokemon like Xerneas are basically always resistant to darkness attacks, so the going through resistance might sometimes be relevant. Take something like a Curlier, for instance. With the resistance, you'd be falling a little bit short. with this going through resistance, you get the KO. But that's free energy to get a KO on a Curlier. You don't want that. I like the first attack. I don't like the second attack. But I absolutely expect to see this popped into decks here and there to do a little bit of good damage either in the early game to take out little Pokemon or in the late game if your opponent plays too many abilities. Because, and I've said this a couple of times, but let me say it one more time, basic Pokemon, colorless energy. So let's go and give this between 3 and 4 Wassies. We don't give half Wassies. That would be barbaric. It is not a phenomenal card, but I can absolutely see this being teched into a whole bunch of decks, so I think that seems fair. But I would very much like to know what you think. So please do let me know in the comment section. Go nuts, but please do remember the rule, ladies and gentlemen. Be nice, would ya? And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at @TheWassie, and Twitch for some live action at twitch.tv/PTCGRadio. If you want to support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all that, head on over to patreon.com/PTCGRadio, where you can do exactly that. And please do make sure you're checking out youtube.com/WassiePlays, where we talk about games that don't have Pokemon in. But by far the most important thing, as always, look after yourselves till next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching PTCG Radio.